Hello and welcome back to another interview with Just in Time Worlds. Today with me is James Sutter, friend of the channel. I think I can call you that after a couple of
Yeah.
interviews. And James, why don't you go ahead and tell our new listeners who you are and why we're seeing you today?
Hi. Well, my name's James L. Sutter, and I've done a lot of different stuff in the past. On this channel, I've talked about my role. I've been in tabletop role-playing games for the last almost 20 years at this point. And so I was the co-creator of the Pathfinder and Starfinder role-playing games. I was the creative director in charge of sort of creating and launching Starfinder. I was also the executive editor of the Pathfinder novel line for many years with Paizo and Tor. I've also written short stories, science fiction, fantasy. I've worked on video games, comic books. I've got two fantasy novels, Death's Heretic and The Redemption Engine, both tied into the Pathfinder universe. And now, after spending all that time in science fiction and fantasy, I've now taken a hard right turn into writing queer contemporary young adult romance novels. So there's no fantasy in it whatsoever. It's just straight up young adult romance. And my new book is called Darkhearts. Here's a picture of actually the Finnish version, which I'm very excited about. Um, and yeah, it's all about falling in love with the boy who stole your chance to become a rock star.
So, I first want to just ask about your cover because I really did think it was gorgeous. Did you have any input in that, or was it all?
Yeah. No, I got a lot of input, which was really nice because I know that in my time as a books editor, I was very familiar with the fact that authors usually don't get a ton of say in their covers. It's usually I've heard somebody say in the past, the book is yours, an editor talking to an author and saying, the book is yours, the title and the cover are mine, because the publisher is the one who knows how to sell the book to the market. But that said, my publisher, Wednesday Books, was just incredibly welcoming and really interested in what I had to say, which was lovely because I feel like a lot of young adult romance covers are not really my jam. Like I don't like they a lot of the art styles that have gotten popular at various points in recent years are just not a thing that appeals to me. So when we went into it, I was saying, the boys in the book, they start this band together that's very much like sort of a goth rock sort of, The Cure but poppier kind of thing. And I was saying I would love to have like a book cover that has a little bit of that rock and roll kind of show poster feel. And so we went back and forth a lot. Like the original artist idea they sent me didn't have the right vibe for me. It felt much more sort of like one of those velvet blacklight posters from the 70s. And I was kind of like, that's not really the thing. And so then they went back and brought a different artist. And pretty much the cover designer, Carrie Resnick, uh, her second attempt was basically the cover as you see it now. Like there were a few things that were different, but the boys were there, the pose was there, the heart, all of that, the typography, and I just immediately fell in love because I looked at that and I go, "Oh, this has that show poster album cover kind of feel." Like I look at it and it almost feels like a 1980s like Duran Duran cover or something, which I loved. And then also, it's very clearly a gay romance. Like here's, the boys right on the cover, looking, pretty close to how they look in the book. And so that and the typography, honestly, I'm such a design nerd, but the typography just killed me. Like I love it. The Darkhearts and like seeing my name like that kind of gave me a shiver. So I was very, very happy with this cover. And actually, we just got the cover in for my second book, which will be my second young adult romance, which comes out next summer. And that one is very different, but still just as good. So I feel like I've gotten incredibly lucky working with Wednesday and St. Martin's.
That's awesome. So let's start with what brought about the hard right turn. What inspired you to go into young adult romance?
Well, so it's one of those things where I've enjoyed young adult fiction for a long time. And it even, tried in the past to like dabble in it and it didn't really work. Um, but I was reading a bunch of it, especially when the pandemic hit. I had been working on this big dystopian science fiction novel. And then the pandemic hit and I just burnt out because we were living in a dystopia. I didn't want to be working on one. And so I was reading all of this young adult romance because the thing I love about most young adult romance is you already kind of know, like, especially if it's contemporary young adult romance set in the real world, there's no world building. There's no, like, you already kind of know the plot because it's romance. So you know they're going to get together at the end. Um, usually the world is not about to end. And so the stakes are comparatively low. They're just, are these two characters going to get together? And so what's left is character and voice. And I feel like so much young adult plays with character and voice in a really beautiful way. And so it becomes these really compelling characters that live in your heads. And also, I was just finding a lot of young adult that was really funny. I read Red, White, and Royal Blue was probably the book that most pushed me to be like, I want to try doing this. But so I was just devouring all of this for fun because I was so burnt out on science fiction fantasy. And then one morning, I was lying in bed reading the Wikipedia page for Stuart Sutcliffe, who was the original bassist for the Beatles. And he left right before the band got big. And so I was lying there thinking, God, what would it have felt like to have left your band right before they got just immortal? And, I really connected with that idea. And then because I was reading so much romance, I was then thinking, and then what if you fell in love with one of the band members? And so I leapt out of bed and started writing this book. I wrote the first two chapters just sort of in a rush and sort of sat back and went, this is probably a bad idea. Like I have I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer. Like I have a science fiction fantasy agent who is waiting on a book and it is not this book. But I could just tell that, as I was writing, that there was a spark there. That was funny, that it was fun, that it let me use sort of my authentic voice because this book ties into a lot of aspects of my own life. I was never in a band that got famous without me, but I definitely was in a lot of bands when I was young. And I remember that feeling of being 18 and watching younger bands, come up behind me and start getting signed or blowing up and thinking, oh, well, I've missed my shot. I'm washed up. I'm 18 and my life is over, And so I really wanted to tap into that feeling that I carried around for so many years that I'd missed my shot to be a rock star. And as it turns out, like as I got older, I actually got to do a lot of cool rock star stuff, like in my 20s. But at the time, it felt like, that life was over, that it was out of my hands. And so I really wanted to tie into that and bring my experience as an underage musician in Seattle into the book. But also, it's a queer romance about a boy who does not initially realize that he is queer. He always has thought of himself as straight, and then suddenly he falls for, his frenemy, former best friend who he now resents terribly because they've gone on and gotten famous without him. Um, so just that wrestling with that idea of like, what does it mean to not be attracted to boys in general, but to be attracted to this one particular boy, kind of explodes his brain. And I very much had that same experience when I was young. And so I wanted to tap into that idea of what does it mean when the labels you use to describe yourself to the rest of the world, but also to yourself, no longer fit right. And so that's really what the book is about, at sort of a philosophical level. But also, it is a rom-com. It is set in Seattle. It's very much my love letter to my city. It's in my neighborhood where I live, so a lot of my favorite locations are in there. And yeah, it's fun. It's about music. It's friends to enemies to friends to lovers. And I think it's the best thing I've ever written.
Okay. So, do you identify as queer?
Yes,
Um,
yeah. Yeah, no, I'm a bisexual man and I've known that, but I've only known that since my 20s, right? Like I think I was about 21 when something finally clicked. So the kids in this book are a little bit younger. They're, 17, 17 and 18. But I sort of hope that by putting that element of my experience in there, maybe some other kid will read this book and it won't take him quite as long to figure things out as it did for me.
So I read it, and I guess one of the things that that I picked up on there was that queer theme, and it's also one of the things that I identified with, since like you, I'm bisexual, so it's a journey of discovery,
Yeah.
that particular label. So I guess my question around that was, did you find it awkward to write about that? Did you find that kind of, or
Not
cathartic?
not in so I more cathartic than awkward, right? Like there's always awkward when you're pulling from your own life. There's and not directly, it's not autobiographical, but there's definitely plenty of details that are pulled from my own life to the point where, every so often there's definitely somebody I had to send a copy of the book to and be like, "Hey, this chapter, like you were there for this. I hope that's cool." Like this is like, thanks. But no, in general, I felt like it was really nice because it was a chance to sort of have a lot of discussions and sort of conversations that I wish somebody had had with me when I was younger, especially around labels. There's a couple scenes in the book where, older queer characters or an older queer character is kind of mentoring him, the main character, a little bit and just saying like, more eloquently than I can say right now, but just kind of don't worry so much about the labels. Figure out what it is that you like and what it is that you want and just go for it. Like the labels are a useful handle, sort of for the rest of the world. They're a shorthand, but don't feel bound by them. You don't have to choose a flag right out of the gate and then that's your, little corner of queerdom. Because a thing that I found a lot, growing up, once I did realize I was bi, was especially at the time when I was doing it in, the place like Seattle was very queer friendly, but even then, like bisexuality was not really a thing. Like at least in the social circles that I was running in, like there are plenty of gay guys, but the idea was like, well, women may be bi, but if you're a bi guy, you're just a gay guy who hasn't finished coming all the way out of the closet yet. And so I didn't have a lot of like role models. I didn't have a lot of people to sort of show me the way. I definitely remember being at a gay bar at one point, and having a couple of gay guys, very compassionately explaining to me that like bisexuality is not a thing. Like you just like, and they were actually like, it's okay to be the straight friend. Like we love that you're here. We love that you're an ally. And it's like, no, I'm here. Like without going into specifics, like I have earned my stripes, like whatever, like, and when they finally sort of understood that like, no, I really was a bi guy, it was like they'd found a unicorn. They were like calling their friends over, be like, oh my God, look, we found one, and so I felt like there was a lot of that, when I was coming up. And so this book definitely dives into that. Like it's a very different atmosphere now, especially in Seattle with the younger generations. I feel like people are so much more accepting, but also depending on where you live, like, things can be, just because culture has moved forward in some places does not mean that it is easy, or that it's universal. So I hope that this book helps some kids, or frankly, some adults, um, figure out, how to feel at home with the label, because that was the big issue for me. Is like it was not hard for me to accept that I liked guys. It was hard for me to accept that I could claim the queer label because I felt like a poser, right? Coming up as a little punk rocker, like it's very, are you really punk is sort of like that perennial question. And so that idea of like, are you really queer? Like, do you deserve to exist in queer spaces if you're only sort of queer? Like today, I'm married to a woman. I am straight passing, depending on who you're talking to. But and so with that, like I had a lot of confusion early on where I was like, well, I haven't, like I have gay friends and, trans friends and people who have fought and struggled really hard for their identity. And like, is me saying I'm queer too, like stolen valor, like I didn't have to fight for anything. And so it took me for a long time to sort of recognize that, like, yes, there is a place in the queer community for bi people, for me. And it's not about fighting. It's about, and like what you've suffered, and it shouldn't be. It's about who you are, what you like, and that's kind of it.
I think those are great words to live by in general. And I wholeheartedly agree. Just on that note, I, I was thinking about it today, and I don't know if it was because I read your book over the weekend, but I was thinking about it today, thinking like, it is so odd to see a bi man in fiction. Like nine
Yeah.
times out of 10, there's a lot of LGBTQ representation these days, right? I'm not saying there's not,
Yeah.
but it is actually odd to see a bi man in fiction, and it is equally odd to see a fully lesbian woman. Like nine
Yeah.
times out of 10, it'll be a bi woman or a gay guy. Like,
Right.
at
Because
least
those are
that's
the
my kind of
stereotypes.
experience. I haven't looked at stats, so this is just,
No, I mean, I think those are stereotypes that if you just look at sort of the history of queer acceptance in popular culture, like those were the stereotype, like the forms of queer that sort of got accepted first, right? Like the gay male in some ways got accepted before the bi male because like we had these stereotypes of like, oh, the gay guy is the funny one, it's Will and Grace. It's like those sort of examples. And similarly, like the bisexual woman, I think, I don't know if you want to call it
male
acceptance or
fantasies.
not, but yeah, exactly. It played into a lot of male fantasies. But yeah, and actually, one thing I really wanted to do with this book that I'm very proud of is a number of reviews have called it, for better and for worse, like a very boy book. And like these are teenage boys who, yes, they are queer, yes, they are in love, but they feel like teenage boys, or at least teenage boys as I was and I understand them, which means that, like, yes, they are sweet and sensitive and in love, and also they are horny and sweaty and foul-mouthed and confused about their feelings. And like, I felt like it was really important to show like you can have these big romantic moments and also you can have a whole bunch of dick jokes, because like they are teenage boys. And I feel like sometimes in especially male romance, you end up with these hyper idealized like queer men where it's like, oh, these are just the perfect men. And frankly, I think sometimes that's in order to appeal to like traditional straight male or straight women, because it's just like, oh, look at these boys who are the ideal, like they dance and they they're funny and they're clean and they're sensitive and they have, they're really good with feelings. And I wanted to show that, like, nah, queer boys are still boys. Like they're still 17-year-old dumbasses, right? Like I was, like everybody was. And so I like that this book, at least to some folks, struck that nerve of like feeling like these are real teenage boys, and it's messy and it's complicated, but it's all the realer for that.
So, I mean, let's talk a little bit about the growth of your characters through the books or through the book. The primary growth, of course, was the loss of bitterness from David.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The problem with first person narration is until I've read a book a few times, I'm like, oh, what's the narrator's name again?
Right. Well, and also he's got nicknames too, which always makes a problem.
Yeah.
Um,
So, yeah,
talk us a little
bit through David's arc.
So his arc in the book is very much when the book begins. So the premise of the book is David, when he was in middle school, he formed a band with his best friends, and they played a bunch of shows. They got pretty good for an underage band. But over time, egos got big, people started clashing. And so he stormed out and left the band. And then a few months later, the band got huge without him. So now he's 17, he's stuck in high school while his former best friends have become these world famous pop stars traveling around. And so he's very bitter. He feels like, his shot was taken away from him because, like, in his idea, they pushed him out of the band. And then when one of the other band members dies, he gets thrown back into contact with the lead singer and starts to realize that, like, underneath all the resentment, there's a reason why he was this guy's friend in the first place, why they were so close. And then as they start hanging out again, he starts to realize, oh, maybe it's not just friendship. Like, maybe I actually really have a thing for this guy. And so they start secretly dating. But also, as he does so, David, the main character, starts to think, well, maybe this is my chance, not just at love, but to, like, get back in the band and get the fame and fortune that I've been denied. Like, maybe this is my chance to fix everything that's gone wrong with my life. But of course, when you start seeing your romantic partner as a means to an end, like, that creates a lot of problems. So everything gets messy from there. But for me, really, the book is a lot about David's arc, like, both with his bitterness, but also when I write a book, I try to chart out sort of the emotional arc of every character by thinking about what is their misbelief about the world. Like, what is the flawed reasoning that has led them to this place where they're, and why has it in fact been validated? So the thing about David is that at the start of the book, he's somebody who kind of runs away from everyone and sort of demands that people chase him in order to prove his love, like, or to prove their love for him. And so, he kind of did that in the band setting where he, stormed out. And when they didn't beg him to come back, like, in his mind, that was them abandoning them. Whereas in their minds, they're like, you left, like, you stormed out. But I think that's not an uncommon personality trait of that need to, like, the need to feel like people are fighting for you, even if the person they're fighting is you. And so, but also, the character, you see where that comes from. You see the fact that, like, he has been abandoned, like, he's, in his background, like, his mother left when he was pretty young. And so he's being raised by a single father. And sort of ever since, he's had this pattern of people, girlfriends, the band, whoever, sort of abandoning him in his mind when actually he's kind of pushing them away in order to see, if I push you away, will you come after me? And so the book is really about him learning that that's a terrible way to live. You can't always be testing everyone around you. Sometimes you need to just trust and invest. And sometimes you need to chase other people. Like, sometimes you need to put forth the effort in a relationship and allow yourself to be hurt in order to show up. And so that's very much the arc that he's going through in this book.
And you spoke about red, white, and royal blue.
Yeah.
Any other, like, inspirations? Any thoughts around, like, authors that really kind of inspired this side of you?
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of young adult authors I love. Jeff Zentner is one of my favorites. All of his books are great. David Yoon, his book Frankly in Love was also one of the first sort of young adult romances that I read that made me go, oh, this is great. Rainbow Rowell has a bunch of good ones. God, who else? I'm trying to think. There's also a lot of good fantasy. The Lee Bardugos, Jay Kristoff and Amy Kaufman for, like, Illuminae and stuff like that. But also, Mary H.K. Choi. She's not technically young adult, but all of her stuff focuses on, like, fairly young, just out of college people. And I feel like really has that flavor of sort of gritty honesty that I like to see in a young adult novel. Because I think people think that young adult is that you need to, like, sort of simplify or tamp down, something in order to write for young adult. And I actually think it's the opposite. Like, I find that young adult fiction wrestles with such weightier issues and with so much more emotion than a lot of adult fiction. I think it's very easy, especially in fantasy, but also in thriller and all sorts of other genres, um, for people to kind of make characters that are, maybe they're two-dimensional, like maybe they've got a couple of dimensions, but they're all kind of stand-ins. They're pawns being moved around for this big epic plot. And young adult won't stand for that. Like, young adult is all about getting into why everybody feels that the way that they do. Is that okay? It's messy, it's complicated. And I think it just makes for much more compelling fiction than, you know, hard punching hero, takes on the empire. Like, there's a place for that. I love those stories, but nowadays I actually try to bring as much of my sort of young adult writing experience as I can to my fantasy. Like, I'm also writing the Starfinder comic book series based on the role playing game. I think there's 2 issues out now, and I wrote a 5-issue series for it. And when I did that, the first thing I did was take all of the heroes in the party and chart out what is the emotional arc for each of them. What issues are they going to be wrestling with? Because I think even when you've got a party like in the Starfinder one, where it's like, well, here's my big, reptilian mercenary with the giant gun, and here's my little, rat person engineer who's, in charge of fixing up the starship, and, all these different things. I still think that even when you're writing explosions and action in space, if you can also know what's in those characters' heads, where they're at emotionally, it makes the scene so much richer and deeper. Because instead of just being, you know, I shoot, then they shoot at me, then I shoot at them, suddenly you've got like, well, yeah, it's a firefight, but in the middle of the firefight, this character is worried that they're turning into their father, and this character is over here crushing on this character, but that character is worried about, if they're really making the moral choice or whatever. And all of those things can filter out into the dialogue, it can filter out into the actions that they take, and just make the world much richer. I think people don't appreciate that, like, you know, the reason we like Wolverine from the X-Men is not because he has claws. It's because he's our grumpy mutant dad. Like, that's what's appealing, is it's the characters.
I think one of the most best pieces of advice that I got from an author ever was when Drake said to me, if you're deciding to take on another POV, another point of view character, and include it in your book, they better have an emotional arc, because otherwise, why am I following them?
Yeah. Well, and that was one of the first things that really knocked me out about young adult fiction. I read some books by an author named Abigail Johnson, who I adore her young adult. It's contemporary YA romance. And the thing that I loved was that you had, the main character and her relationship with the love interest, but also every other character in the book, there was an arc there. So, like, her relationship with her mom, it starts in one place and goes to another place. The relationship with the best friend, it starts in one place and goes to another place. And so every character was always, learning, changing, growing, failing. And it made every scene so much richer, and you couldn't, it made everything compelling because there was always something happening. And so that's, I think, one of the best pieces of advice I have for writing is when you get to like, know what every scene is doing, know the function it's serving in the story, and the more functions it can serve, the better. So maybe the scene is, you're trying to break into the wizard's castle, and like, that's fine from a plot perspective. That can be what the scene needs to do, get us into the castle. But the more you can have it also pushing forward the other arcs in the book, the more compelling it'll feel. If, it's not just breaking into the castle, but also it's the point where the barbarian and the ranger first sort of acknowledge that they're falling for each other, or the point where the thief in the party starts to think that maybe they're in the wrong line of work or whatever. The more you can have like this constant feeling of progression, like something is always changing and leading towards something, that'll keep people turning the pages.
Yeah, so I fully agree with that. The other book that I've read recently is Jacqueline Carey's new one, and she, of course, also writes
Right.
romance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you've read
I
her books.
haven't, but I've heard so much about, I mean, she's been around forever.
Yeah, so she brought out a flipped. So she did the same events as the first book, but flipped it to the male
Oh,
side.
cool.
Very interesting, yeah. But yeah, so I guess the other question is, did you miss fantasy? Did you miss world
I mean,
building?
well, the nice side is like, because I'm somebody who likes to work in a lot of different genres and media, being able to write this book while also writing adventures, I was still in the same time, I was doing work for Dungeons and Dragons. Like, I got to help work on the reboot of the Dragonlance campaign setting, and I had just reworked Baldur's Gate. They not that long before they put out a new adventure that had sort of a revamping of the setting of the city of Baldur's Gate, and they let me come in and sort of spice it up a bunch, and that was really fun to be handed this property that everybody knows the name Baldur's Gate, and they're like, yeah, spruce it up, redecorate. So that was a pretty fun challenge. Um, and at the same time, I was also writing for Pathfinder and Starfinder, both the comics and the adventures. So I think being able to do multiple things at once keeps it fresh. And I actually, in the last year, I started working in horror for the first time ever, and sort of dark fantasy. So I published a couple of short stories in Nightmare Magazine and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. And those really gave me a chance to sort of play with different voices, different world building. So yeah, I'm always all over the place. Young adult. I hope that young adult romance is somewhere that I can stay for a while. But I will not be surprised if you see a fantasy novel from me in a couple of years.
So were you tempted to turn to like at least urban fantasy? I mean, the young adult urban fantasy is, of course,
You
all
know,
the rage.
I was initially, when I was thinking about it, I was thinking like, well, I'm a fantasy and science fiction guy. Like that's where my audience is. I should I should try to make this fantasy somehow. But I knew the story that I wanted to tell, and it just seemed like adding a fantastical element would be too complicated. Like it wasn't what the book needed. And so I ended up just saying, you know what, I'm just going to write a straight up contemporary. That's fine. That said, the young adult romance that I have coming out next year does have a fantasy element in that it's called The Ghost of Us, and it's about a teenage ghost hunter who finds a ghost. And then it's kind of 10 Things I Hate About You, except that one of them is dead. And so it's this whole sort of fake dating scheme involving a ghost and a sibling. And it was really fun. It was really fun to sort of bring back in that world building element of like, okay, now I'm going to decide what are all the rules around ghosts, and how they work in this world. And so it's definitely still set in the real world. It's set outside of Seattle. So it wasn't a full on secondary world fantasy, but anytime you drop a little bit of fantasy in, suddenly you have to start making all those decisions about the rules, and everything gets much more complicated.
Like, how does this actually work? Is it a secret? Is it not a secret? Like, what happens if it gets out? All of those
Exactly.
open fantasy questions.
It's almost like designing a magic system. I felt like that was my experience of doing the sort of design around the ghost and what the ghost's abilities, what they can do. It's that same sort of process of figuring out like, okay, when you start to give magic powers, you need to look at all the ramifications, like all the plot things you want to do in the book. Can you still do them if this magic exists? How is it going to circumvent different angles, and that can be really fun because when you give yourself just a couple of powers to work with, it can twist the plot in really interesting directions as you maybe can't use your first idea for everything. You have to get a little bit more creative. But also, there's always that revision practice of you create a magic system, you start writing the story, and somewhere in the middle of the story you go, oh, this would be much more fun if they couldn't do X. And then you have to go, like, if you want to take that out, you have to go all the way back to the start and revise, according to the rules. Like I'm still, even now, just like putting the finishing touches on that book, making sure everything is right in place, magic system wise. But it's been fun.
Yeah. So I'll look forward to that one. So I guess if you're settling into that, what else are you doing? Like, is there anything else coming out? You said you did the Baldur's Gate and the Dragonlance revamps.
Oh yeah, those were a little while ago. But right now I've mostly been focusing on fiction, so I don't have any new adventures or anything coming out. But yeah, the ongoing Starfinder, it's called Starfinder Angels of the Drift, and it's starting out with a 5-issue series that I got to write, and it's halfway out right now, so it's in comic stores if you want to check it out. And that's really fun. That's a rag. It's got a very like Guardians of the Galaxy kind of feel to it. So it's a ragtag band of mercenaries who are tasked with bringing faster than light travel to a previously uncontacted world. And so you've got it stars all of the, or not all of, but a bunch of the classic sort of iconic characters from the Starfinder role playing games. So the characters that we use to illustrate each class and like player species in the book, we get to flesh out their characters and so see them, going around having these adventures together. And so that's a really fun sort of romp. It's got that kind of 80s comedy sort of thing where it's like it's it's action. It's full of science fiction action, but it's also kind of funny. I think it's quite funny. And also like fundamentally you get that feeling of the characters all really care about each other, which is something that I really like seeing. I think that one of the things that I wanted to capture in the comic was that feeling of playing a role-playing game, of you're sitting around the table with your friends, and even while your characters are bickering and bantering, like because you, the players, are all friends, you can sort of feel that love seeping into the characters. And so I really wanted that to be in here too, where like, yes, it is action. Yes, it is an adventure. And also these characters are all really like, they care about each other.
Okay, so Darkhearts is available where? Everywhere?
Everywhere, yeah, and it's in a bunch of different languages as well. I was just saying, with the Finnish version, I'm very excited about, but it's also in, in addition to English, in audiobook, in ebook format, wherever you want to go. It's also in Dutch. It's going to be in Portuguese, Spanish, Czech, Russian. Um, a couple more. So it's going to be kind of all over the place.
So it's going to be, I read the English version. The Finnish version is going to be very interesting because we were having this conversation just offline. But Finnish is not gendered. Finnish does not have a gendered pronoun. So I'm quite interested to see how that plays out.
Me too. Me too. Oh, and I should throw out with the audiobook version, I'm especially excited about because I talked about how Red, White, and Royal Blue was one of the books that made me want to write one of these. And in part it was because the audiobook narrator was so funny. Like I found myself laughing constantly while listening to it. So when we did the Darkhearts audiobook, we were able to get that same narrator to come do my book. So that was super fun. And then also, when you're listening to audiobooks, especially on Audible or whatever, there's often that sort of some intro and outro music right at the start and end. And I'd always wondered, like, who makes that? Like, somebody has to make that music. And so when Macmillan Audio bought the rights to my book, I asked, like, who does this? And like, can I apply to write the music? And I said, yeah, sure. So I ended up getting to write the intro and outro music for my audiobook. And so if you listen to Darkhearts, that little bit of music at the beginning and end is me.
That's awesome. That is awesome.
Yeah, bucket list.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so for everybody out there, I've read Darkhearts, highly recommend. links down in the description and in the comments. There will be links to both the Finnish version, if you're Finnish, as well as the English version, if you're anything else.
Yeah.
And
yeah, and people can always find me on my website at jameslsutter.com, or I'm on the website formerly known as Twitter at James L. Sutter, or on Instagram at James_L_Sutter. So yeah, I'm always happy to. I know we didn't get a ton into world building on this, but like, especially when I haven't been teaching a lot of classes recently, but I love talking about this stuff. So if you've got questions about world building, role playing games, any of that sort of thing, feel free to hit me up. I'm always around.
Definitely. And there will be links to James's website where you can get all those details as well. Any closing thoughts about Darkhearts? Any complicated world building you did in your contemporary romance?
Well, actually, one thing that is funny is I did very deliberately try to approach the setting the same way I would for a fantasy novel, where, even though it was Seattle, I was thinking, I want to think about this the way I would think about a fantasy city. So I really sat down and thought through, like, what are the things, whenever I'm doing something set in a fantasy city, I try to think, what are the things that are really memorable about this particular city? What are the things that would make a great action scene? What are the things that would look good on a movie poster or a book cover? Those are the sort of questions that I ask. And so when I was doing this, I did kind of the same thing where I was like, if Seattle was a fantasy city, what are the things that I would fit into that little, gazetteer entry in the adventure book? Like, what are the locations that are going to be really fun and interesting and feel like Seattle? So those things are where I set all their dates and things. And I think, I've had a couple people say this book feels very Pacific Northwest. Like, you can tell that I'm from Seattle and that this is a book as much about the city as anything. And so, yeah, I hope that I manage to world build as well in this as I do when I'm making the city up.
And I think that is a good note on which to end today's interview. And let us know in the comments what you think. And I'll see you soon for another one.
Thank you so much.